In the next few minutes, I'm going to break down 10 weird facts hidden inside the Great St. Louis Bank Robbery from 1959. The kind of details most people miss because the movie doesn't shout them at you. This isn't a glossy heist legend story. It's a slow procedural warning label dressed up as a crime film. And once you see what's really going on, you'll understand why this title quietly shaped the way modern true crime storytelling works. Here are the first 10. The movie can't even agree on what it's called. The advertising wants the Great St. Louis Bank Robbery big and bold, like you're about to watch a national scandal, but the film has circulated under multiple names depending on the print, the territory, and the decade you ran into it. Some releases present the opening credits as the St. Louis Bank Robbery, trimming the bravado into something that sounds like a case file, cold and official. Then the international market steps in and starts playing dress up. In some territories, it was sold as Rififi in St. Louis, a shameless attempt to borrow the reputation of Jules Dassin's heist classic and promise viewers a slick, stylish caper. Only this isn't slick. It's tight, nervous, and procedural. The camera watches planning, waiting, and mistakes, not glamorous criminal genius. So, the title becomes a trap. If you come in expecting French noir swagger, you get an American semi-documentary. If you come in expecting a newspaper headline, you get something closer to a police training film with teeth. And if you come in expecting a simple St. Louis crime yarn, you're suddenly watching a movie that keeps reminding you it's great, only because it's brazen enough to exist at all. One story, 3 labels, 3 different promises. It's marketing as misdirection. And it's the first sign this film was always half crime, half con. Even collectors argue about which name is real, but the movie keeps grinning and refusing to answer today. This wasn't dreamed up in a writer's room. It was built around a real St. Louis case, and the movie keeps that real-world skeleton visible. The story is based on a 1953 robbery attempt at the Southwest Bank, a job that went sideways so fast, it basically wrote its own cautionary lesson. Instead of inventing a flashy mastermind, the film leans into the mundane details that real criminals obsess over: routes, timing, alibis, and the tiny equipment choices that feel harmless until they aren't. Then it does something quietly brutal. It shows how ordinary stress fractures turn into catastrophic mistakes. That semi-documentary vibe isn't an aesthetic flex. It's a way of saying, this happened to real people, in real rooms, with real consequences. Even when character names and certain specifics are dramatized, the core idea remains. This was a local crime that St. Louis residents still talked about. And the film is basically a cinematic reenactment with a studio polish. If you've ever wondered why the robbery feels less like a Hollywood caper and more like a procedural report, that's why. It's not trying to romanticize the crew. It's trying to pin them to the board like evidence and let you watch the moment the case snaps shut. The real incident involved a violent clash that left a police sergeant wounded and forced the city to confront how quickly a simple bank job becomes a gunfight in daylight at close range. The movie never lets you forget that edge. Several of the law enforcement faces you see on screen aren't actors in the traditional sense. They're the people who actually lived the case. The production recruited local police and investigators, and at least one key figure, Sergeant Mel Steen, appears as himself. That decision flips the usual crime movie relationship with authenticity. Instead of consulting cops and then Hollywoodizing everything, the film puts the real authority in frame, letting them move, talk, and handle scenes the way they would in the real world. It's why the procedural beats feel so unvarnished. The spacing between people, the bluntness of the questions, the lack of theatrical speeches. There's also an eerie power dynamic at work. When a real officer shares scenes with young professional actors, the actors can't dominate the room with charm, because the person opposite them carries the weight of having actually stood in the bank, actually responded to the call, actually dealt with the aftermath. It turns the movie into a hybrid, half reenactment, half drama, with documentary fingerprints all over it. And here's the weird part. This technique makes the criminals feel smaller, not cooler, not mythic, just trapped inside a system run by calm people who already know how the story ends. For 1959, that kind of casting was unusual outside documentaries, and it carried risk. If the real participants look stiff, the whole movie collapses. Guggenheim and Stix leaned into the stiffness, using it as texture, like a sworn statement read aloud in court. Today, too.
Hey, Bob? Yeah? Make mine a ham on Ryan.
The city of St. Louis isn't just a setting here. It's a co-star, and the production treated it that way. Instead of hiding in a studio and faking Midwest streets with painted backdrops, the filmmakers went on location and used real St. Louis spaces to sell the authenticity. That matters because the geography is part of the tension. You're not watching anonymous alleys and generic corners. You're watching routes that feel lived in, with a local texture that keeps the movie grounded even when the plotting gets intense. St. Louis Magazine later highlighted how the film was shot in St. Louis and drew on local participation, which is a big swing for a small crime picture. On-location shooting also forces a different kind of performance. Actors can't act big when the background is real traffic, real sidewalks, and real people who aren't impressed. The camera has to work faster, the blocking has to be simpler, and the story has to earn attention without fancy production tricks. And the result is that the city itself becomes a silent witness. Every brick wall and storefront feels like it could testify. In a normal heist movie, the environment is decoration. Here, it's evidence. Proof that this story didn't float in from Hollywood. It crawled out of a specific place with a specific history, and it never lets you forget that. Locals could recognize corners and buildings, which meant the movie had to be careful because the audience could fact-check in time. This film looks like a major city crime story, but it was made with surprisingly modest money, and you can see the discipline everywhere. St. Louis Magazine reports a budget around $125,000, and notes that a then unknown Steve McQueen was paid about $400 a week. That combo is wild in hindsight, because McQueen would become a symbol of cool within a few years. But here, he's still grinding, still proving, still sharing the screen with a cast designed to feel ordinary. The low budget also explains the movie's stripped-down rhythm. There's no padding, no glamorous detours, no indulgent romance subplot to soften the crime. The story moves like a checklist because production probably had to move like a checklist. Limited days, limited setups, and no time to waste light on scenes that don't push the robbery forward. And oddly, that scarcity becomes an aesthetic. Because the film can't distract you with spectacle, it leans harder on process. How the job is planned, how the crew talks themselves into believing it will work, and how quickly confidence decays once reality shows up. It's a reminder that sometimes cheap doesn't mean sloppy. Sometimes it means focused, ruthless, and unable to afford a single unnecessary minute. The production's thrift likely pushed it toward real locations and real personnel, because building sets and hiring extras costs more than borrowing a city. So, the budget doesn't just shape what you see, it shapes what you believe, and it works. The most Hollywood thing about the movie might be the least Hollywood person behind it. Charles Guggenheim wasn't primarily a studio feature director. He came from documentary work, and this project functioned like a bridge between non-fiction discipline and crime movie suspense. That background matters because the film is built on observation, not ornament. Scenes linger on procedure, stakeouts, planning, conversations that sound like real people thinking out loud. Because that's how a documentarian finds drama, by watching normal behavior until it reveals stress. St. Louis Magazine frames the picture as a notable local production and emphasizes how Guggenheim and co-director John Stix pulled St. Louis institutions into the filmmaking process, which is a very documentary impulse. The weird part is that you can feel Guggenheim resisting the urge to make it pretty. He doesn't chase romantic shadows or poetic speeches. He chases clarity. And clarity can be terrifying in a bank robbery story, because when every step is understandable, every mistake is also undeniable. You don't get to hide behind movie logic. You watch a plan assemble, then you watch it crack, and you can almost sense the director thinking like an investigator. What did they think would happen? What actually happened? And where did the story break? It's crime cinema, with a reporter's heartbeat. Years later, Guggenheim would be known as a documentary figure with 4 Academy Awards and 12 nominations, noted by the Truman Library. That makes this St. Louis crime feature feel like an outlier, and also a clue. Depending on where you watch it, you might not be watching the exact same movie. Listings and circulating prints don't always agree on the runtime, which sounds minor until you realize a few minutes in a tightly wound heist can change the whole rhythm. Some references put it around the high 80s in minutes, while other references in public prints land a few minutes shorter. In a modern studio release, that kind of variance would trigger a restoration debate. Here, it's part of the film's strange afterlife, an independent, modestly budgeted crime movie that traveled in different packages, sometimes cropped, sometimes trimmed, sometimes presented in slightly different formats. Even the framing can shift your perception. Many people first see it in battered television-style transfers, where the image feels boxed in, but some references note wider theatrical proportions, which changes how claustrophobic the bank interiors feel and how exposed the streets look. This is a procedural story, and procedurals rely on pacing. When you shave minutes, the planning feels more abrupt. When you expand the frame, the surveillance feels less intimate and more vulnerable. So, a weird little fact becomes a viewer trap. Two people can swear they saw the same film, then argue about why it felt different, and both can be right. The robbery is the same. The presentation isn't. And with this movie, presentation is half the con. That's why it pops up in places like niche streaming catalogs and free online uploads with slightly different timings and crops today. Number 8. Steve McQueen is in this, but not the Steve McQueen your brain automatically pictures. He's credited as George Fowler, a young man hired into the robbery plan as the getaway driver, and the casting works because he still feels rough around the edges, more restless than iconic. That matters because the movie's tension depends on instability inside the crew. A later, superstar version of McQueen might have pulled the story toward charisma and dominance. Here, he reads as expendable, which is exactly what a real robbery crew often does to its youngest member. You're useful, you're replaceable, and you're the first person they'll blame if something goes wrong. St. Louis magazine notes he was essentially unknown at the time and was paid a modest weekly salary, which fits the on-screen vibe. Hungry, not polished. Even the way the film frames him feels different from star treatment. There's no glamorous lighting, no heroic angles. He's often boxed in by cars, doorways, and cramped rooms, visually reminding you that a getaway driver spends most of his life waiting for somebody else's decision to explode his world. And the strangest part is this. If you watch with modern eyes, you can almost see the future stardom trying to leak through, but the movie keeps pushing it back down into the grime. It's McQueen before the myth, trapped in a story that refuses to let anyone be legendary. That's why fans treat it like a time capsule, catching sparks before the fire caught. The movie didn't just borrow St. Louis as scenery, it reportedly used the actual bank at the center of the story, and filled the frame with real locals. That choice is a logistical headache and a psychological gamble. Logistically, filming inside a real bank means you're dealing with tight security, limited shooting windows, and a building that wasn't designed for lights, cables, and camera tracks. Psychologically, it changes the atmosphere for everyone. A set can be acted in. A real bank carries weight. The counters are real, the back rooms are real, the echo is real, and the sense of violation is harder to fake. One listing description even notes the picture was shot on location, at the actual Southwest Bank, and involved dozens of local residents and bank employees, which is an unusual approach for a crime drama. That detail explains why so many background faces look unpolished. They're not extras performing fear. They look like people trying to follow instructions while standing in a place they associate with money, work, and safety. And it creates discomfort you can't manufacture. You're watching a staged robbery inside a real financial institution, a performance of violence inside a space designed to project stability. It's like staging a fire drill in a building that already burned once. The weird fact isn't just that they filmed there, it's that the location itself becomes part of the suspense, because the environment is silently resisting the story being acted out inside it for you. Number 10. The film openly wears the label semi-documentary. And that's not just a critic's term, it's basically the movie's operating system. Library descriptions and listings emphasize that it blends dramatic storytelling with documentary-style realism, including the participation of real police officers and even an FBI agent playing themselves. That framing changes how the tension works. In a typical heist film, suspense comes from mystery. You don't know the plan, you don't know the system, and you're shocked when something is revealed. Here, suspense comes from exposure. You're shown the plan, you're shown the weak points, you're shown the institutional response. So instead of wondering what happens, you start wondering how long until it breaks, which is a more uncomfortable kind of viewing. It also explains why the dialogue can feel blunt and the scenes can feel clinical. The movie isn't trying to charm you. It's trying to persuade you that this is what a robbery looks like when you strip away movie myth and keep the mechanics. And once you see crime as mechanics, the criminals stop being anti-heroes and start being liabilities. People gambling with time, panic, and other people's bodies. If you want the next 10 numbers, stay with me. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. That semi-documentary posture is why the movie feels oddly educational without ever preaching. It treats the robbery like a chain of decisions you can rewind and analyze, which is exactly what real investigators do after the sirens stop, finally. The movie wears two titles like a disguise. In theaters, it was sold as The Great St. Louis Bank Robbery, but the opening credits quietly drop the "Great" and call it The St. Louis Bank Robbery. That little switch was not an accident. Great promises legend. Dropping it promises a police report. It frames the story as something that happened down the street, not a caper you clap for. The filmmakers were protecting the tone. This is a heist movie that keeps reminding you it is a warning. United Artists Marketing needed the bigger adjective to pull in crime fans, but Guggenheim and Styx wanted the audience to feel like witnesses. So, the film's first trick is linguistic. It sells you spectacle, then hands you paperwork. And that mismatch is why the movie feels oddly modern, like true crime before the term existed. You arrive expecting swagger, and the title card quietly tells you, no, this is evidence. Decades later, the confusion survives in TV guides and streaming metadata, where one name leads to another, and viewers think they've found two films. It's fitting, because the story itself is about men hiding behind labels until the city recognizes them. It wasn't based on a robbery so much as haunted by one. The story pulls directly from the failed Southwest Bank job in St. Louis in 1953, and the production didn't wait a generation to dramatize it. They shot in St. Louis in 1958, close enough that the city still remembered the sirens. That time gap matters because it changes the emotional texture. A period crime film can romanticize. A recent crime film has to negotiate with neighbors. Locations aren't sets, they're landmarks people drive past every day, and that makes the tension feel local, not mythic. Even the planning scenes carry a strange guilt, like the characters are rehearsing in a room that still smells of newsprint. You can sense the filmmakers choosing restraint where a studio picture would choose glamour. No slick montages, no charming banter. Just men convincing themselves they're professionals while the audience already knows the plan is doomed. It's also why the movie plays like an early true crime reconstruction. It isn't interested in cleverness. It's interested in how quickly decisions turn into irreversible ones. That's the weirdest part. The film's proximity to the real event makes it feel colder, not hotter. The most unsettling extras were not extras. The film used members of the St. Louis Police Department, local residents, and even bank employees, placing them back into a version of the moment they had lived through. That choice is easy to sell as authenticity, but it has a sharper edge. A professional actor performs fear, a real participant remembers it, and the camera reads that difference instantly. It also flips the power dynamic on set. Normally, a director controls the world. Here, the world has its own authority, because the people in uniform know where the doors are, how the radios work, what the hallways actually sound like when you run. So, the movie's realism isn't just texture, it's friction. Every time a scene leans toward melodrama, a real procedure pulls it back. The weird fact is how that hybrid makes the criminals look smaller. In a studio heist, robbers feel like chess players. Here, they feel like amateurs who wandered into a system that already has rules, routines, and muscle memory. And when the police surge into frame, it doesn't feel like a plot beat. It feels like the city itself has decided it's done watching today. Steve McQueen's presence is a time capsule of fame arriving late. He plays George Fowler, the getaway driver, and the role is intentionally unglamorous. A young man who thinks driving is safe, who believes he can stay clean while others get dirty. During production, he was still a working actor, not a cultural icon, which is why the film treats him as one piece of a larger mechanism. Then the weird timing hit. Between filming and release, McQueen broke out on television as Josh Randall in Wanted Dead or Alive, so audiences suddenly showed up expecting him to dominate the movie. He doesn't. The camera doesn't worship him. The story doesn't protect him. And that mismatch creates a strange double viewing experience. You watch with modern eyes, recognizing the star charisma and small gestures, and you also watch the movie insisting he's just another guy making a bad choice. It's almost the perfect embodiment of the film's theme. Identity is fragile, and a label can change overnight. The same man can be unknown driver in one context and future legend in another, but the consequences of the crime don't care which version you are. That is the punchline. The film's most Hollywood element is the one it hides in plain sight, the score. Bernardo Segal's music doesn't blast, it insinuates. It slides under the procedural realism like a thin current under ice, turning ordinary actions into premonitions. That is a risky choice for a semi-documentary crime picture because music can make violence feel stylish, and this film is allergic to style. So, the composer's trick is restraint. Instead of big themes, you get pulses, repeats, and little phrases that feel like clocks you cannot turn off. The weird fact is that the score functions like an accomplice. It doesn't celebrate the criminals, it pressures them, pushing their breathing faster, making every pause sound suspicious. In scenes where men rehearse their plan, the music behaves like the voice in the back of your head that keeps asking, "What did you miss?" That's why the film stays tense even when nothing happens. By the time the robbery begins, you feel like you've already heard the catastrophe ticking for an hour. It is one of the earliest signs that the movie understands suspense as psychology, not spectacle, and that remains surprisingly effective now. No wonder it still feels nervous. The ending feels bleak because the real case was bleaker than Hollywood likes. The 1953 attempt that inspired the story collapsed fast. An officer shot one of the robbers, another robber ended his own life during the standoff. The stolen money was recovered, and the getaway driver ran before being caught days later. The film doesn't turn that into a tidy moral speech, but it borrows the same emotional geometry. The plan fails, and failure arrives in minutes, not hours. That matters because most heist fiction sells competence first and consequence later. This one sells consequence from the opening frame. The criminals spend so much energy controlling timing that they forget the one variable they cannot schedule: the city responding. And because so much of the movie is procedural, the collapse feels procedural too, like a machine resetting itself. The weird fact is how little room the story gives for bad luck. Everything that goes wrong is tied to a human shortcut. One impatience, one assumption, one act of arrogance. It's the same reason true crime audiences stay obsessed. We want to believe disasters are random, but this film keeps whispering they're engineered, one decision at a time. The runtime is short, but the pacing is engineered like a drill. At roughly 89 minutes, the film doesn't have room for romantic detours or witty diversions, so it builds suspense through repetition and routine. Scout, plan, rehearse, move. That structure is why it feels oddly contemporary, like an episode of true crime compressed into a single breath. The weird fact is that the compression makes the violence harsher. In longer heist movies, planning scenes create pleasure, because you get to admire intelligence at work. Here, planning scenes create claustrophobia, because every rehearsal is a reminder that the real world is waiting to interrupt them. The camera watches men pace off distances and test alibis. And instead of feeling clever, it feels compulsive, like a ritual to ward off fear. By the time the robbery begins, you're already tired, which is exactly the point. The criminals are tired too. They are running on adrenaline, ego, and sunk costs. And when everything unravels, the film doesn't slow down to savor it. It just keeps moving forward, as if procedure itself is the true main character. Indifferent to who gets crushed, that blunt momentum is why it still hits hard. This was an independent-minded crime film before indie meant Sundance. Charles Guggenheim was known for documentary work, and the movie carries that discipline into narrative form. Instead of building a controlled backlot bank, the team leaned on real St. Louis spaces. Limitations became style. You see sidewalks, stairwells, parking lots, and office corridors that look stubbornly ordinary because they are. The weird fact is how that ordinariness becomes the horror. Most classic noirs paint cities as dreamscapes. This one paints the city as a system, made of rules and repetition, where the criminal's fantasy of control meets friction at every door. Even the dialogue has a clipped, functional quality, like men talking around their fear instead of about it. And when the police arrive, they don't arrive with cinematic flourish. They arrive like a shift change. That tone is why the film feels less like entertainment and more like a reconstruction assembled to answer one question. How could grown men talk themselves into thinking this would work? It's not moralizing, and it's not glamorous. It is a case study, delivered with just enough drama to keep you watching while the city proves it was never impressed. The tagline told you the whole movie before you saw a frame. Planned like clockwork, it went off like a time bomb. That line is basically the film's operating manual. Everything the crew does in the first half is about clockwork, timing routes, rehearsing small behaviors, treating people like variables. But clockwork has no mercy. Once it starts, it runs, and if one gear slips, the entire mechanism tears itself apart. The weird fact is how the film visualizes that idea without shouting. It keeps returning to mundane markers of time and sequence. Footsteps counted, glances exchanged, doors opened on cue, cars idling. The criminals are so focused on being precise that they become brittle. Precision leaves no space for surprise, and surprise is what cities manufacture. So when the plan collides with reality, it doesn't feel like fate, it feels like physics. A system optimized for perfect conditions meets imperfect conditions and fails exactly as designed. That is why the movie feels educational without being preachy. It lets the audience watch the clockwork being built, then forces them to listen when it breaks, one sharp tick at a time. You realize the countdown began long before the gun. The world premiere wasn't a red carpet fantasy in Los Angeles. It happened in St. Louis, at the Orpheum Theater on January 29, 1959, in front of the city whose streets and uniforms fill the film. That is a strange kind of courage. Most movies prefer distance from their subject, because distance softens emotions. This one leaned in, almost like a public debrief. The weird fact is how that premiere context rewires the viewing experience. If you watch the film in isolation, it's a tight procedural. If you imagine it playing in that room, it becomes something else. A community watching a dramatized version of a trauma that still felt recent. People in the audience could have recognized the corners, the bank facade, even the cadence of local police procedure. And that recognition makes the movie's restraint feel respectful, not dull. It doesn't mythologize the criminals as folk heroes. It treats them as men who misread their own city and paid for it. In that sense, the premiere location is part of the storytelling. The film isn't just set in St. Louis, it was presented back to St. Louis like a mirror, daring viewers to look that night. The film's semi-documentary approach is also its biggest magic trick. It makes you forget you're watching a reconstruction. By blending professional actors with real officers and locals, and by shooting in real spaces, it creates the feeling that the camera simply arrived as history unfolded. But that realism can be misleading, and that's the weird part. A reconstruction is still a decision machine. Somebody chooses which door the robber uses, which witness gets a close-up, which moment deserves music, which mistake deserves emphasis. In other words, the film doesn't just show an event. It edits a theory of why the event happened. It suggests that failure was baked in, not random, because the men involved carried the wrong mental model of how institutions respond. That is a modern lesson dressed in 1950s clothing. You can rehearse a system, but you cannot rehearse the system's reaction to you. The movie becomes a quiet critique of smart plans and a celebration of boring competence. The police aren't heroic because they're cinematic. They're heroic because they're procedural. And in a story about a robbery, that may be the strangest twist of all. Order beats bravado when pressure hits hardest.